Alright, so the first book I'm going to be discussing this week is Separate is Never Equal, Sylvia Mendez and Her Family's Fight for Desegregation. And it is written and illustrated by Duncan Tonatiuh, and I really hope I'm pronouncing that correctly because I don't like mispronouncing people's names. So he wrote and illustrated it, and just a little bit of background about him. He is from Mexico, actually. He was born in Mexico and raised in Mexico, and but his work has had him travel into the United States a lot, and so he has probably some personal experience with immigration from Mexico to the U.S., either himself or family or friends that he's known. And his work, he's won the Prix Belpré Award for Illustration, which is honoring illustrators' contributions to Mexican-American literature. So that's a little bit of background about him. He has a very unusual art style. If you kind of look at the front cover, it's very like profile, two-dimensional, kind of some exaggerated features. It's actually, I looked into this earlier, a primitive art style known as Mixtec, and it's sort of similar to what the Mayans and the Aztecs and earlier Mesoamerican civilizations like that used in their drawings and illustrations, and he's kind of honoring his heritage by using that particular art style and kind of keeping that art style alive. So this book in particular took place in the 1944 to 1947, and it was about school segregation. And so Sylvia Mendez, all of the people in this were actually real people, and so she moved from one town in Southern California to another, and she was forced to go to the Mexican school in her neighborhood instead of the white school in her neighborhood because, you know, they were of Mexican-American descent, even though she was a full American citizen. Segregation at the time said, since you wear this skin color, you must go to this school. And so she had told her parents about this, and the resources were awful, and the school conditions were terrible. They were eating their lunch outside, which was next to a cow pasture, and so it was just very not good conditions. And flies when they were eating outside, so not good. And so her father actually started the fight for school integration, not school segregation. They wanted to desegregate the schools. He was fighting for school integration so that his children could get the appropriate resources and have opportunity to an actual education. And so it ended up going to a court case. It didn't go as high as the Supreme Court, which is why more often than not we've probably heard of Brown versus Board of Education instead of this particular court case. But the court case represented 4 school districts in not Orange County, in the county at the time, representing about 5,000 different Mexican-American students who were being forced to be in these conditions. And at first they took it to the district county level, and the district county agreed with Sylvia and her family that they should have the same opportunities as their white counterparts, as their white classmates to education. But the school board and the school district did not like that answer, so they appealed to the state court level, where Thurgood Marshall was actually the judge on the case, and he also supported the decision that schools should be integrated and that you should not be denied an opportunity to a good education just because of the color of your skin. It did not make it all the way to the Supreme Court. The school district did not appeal past that point. And Thurgood Marshall actually went on to be a judge in the Brown versus Board of Education case, which took place 7 years later after this court case. So I thought that kind of reading about that history was interesting because they brought that up in the book. And I personally have only ever heard of the Brown versus Board of Education case, which might be because it's a Supreme Court case. But I think that also just kind of shows that the lack of diverse stories, that not just stories, but history that we've been told. Not just here, there are 2 sides to the story, but on one side there's always going to be more stories than just the one that's told. And so I've heard about Brown versus Board of Education and Ruby Bridges, but I had never heard the name Sylvia Mendez before reading this book. And so I thought it was very interesting to read about that and realize that, you know, it was not just a black versus white school segregation issue. It was also happening against Mexican Americans Native Americans. In one of the articles we read, I think it mentioned a girl who was Inuit, so Alaskan Native tribes. And so I just thought that that was kind of interesting to read a little bit more about this. So part of what we had to do this week was kind of looking at the graphics and picking one that kind of represents the the discrimination in race that people faced. And so my first one I picked is on page 19, and it's the picture of the pool. So the white children are in the pool, and the Mexican children are not allowed to be in the pool. And actually on the other page it says, no dogs or Mexicans allowed public pool. Because at the time, this was happening around the mid-40s, early 50s, it wasn't just schools that were segregated, it was public places. So bathrooms were segregated between whites and people of color. Pools were segregated between whites and people of color, water fountains, movie theaters, all that. And so this picture to me kind of just showed, and there were actually literal bars, so it was kind of showing the inferiority that whites viewed people of color in, and they thought of themselves as the superior people. And there was also a part in the story where it started talking about the hygiene of Mexicans, and that's one of the reasons they had to be segregated from the white children, was because they lacked a good sense of personal hygiene. And so I kind of took this illustration to kind of be, they're so dirty, like their skin, whether it was the skin color or just the fear of their spread of different diseases, I'm not entirely sure the whole argument for personal hygiene, other than to be just treating other people awfully, was to kind of see like, oh, you are so dirty that we do not even want you in our pools. Because this picture kind of made me think of a picture that I've seen associated with the civil rights movement of black people in a pool, and it was either they were in their own pool and white people poured bleach or acid in the water, or they were in a white pool kind of protesting like a boycott sit-in, and white people then poured bleach or acid into the pool. I can't remember exactly which at the moment, but that was what it got me thinking of. And so I was wondering, like, is that part of the argument for the hygiene? Like, do they think that the skin colors are different because Mexicans, black people, Native Americans are actually like dirtier? Or do they just look down on the kind of work that they do and they kind of view the work as degrading? Which also didn't really make sense, because it mentioned that Sylvia's dad actually worked his way up from a sharecropping farm and was able to actually end up owning his own farm and actually having employees of his own. So that was the one that kind of, I think, depicted racism and discrimination the most. And that was a very stark contrast because these are children, and I think that a lot of the time kids don't really understand why things are the way that they are, and they don't really take them at that face value that adults seem to, like, oh, this is the way it is, so let's not go and mess with the status quo. The kids are like, I don't see why it's this different. I don't see why just because my skin is different, I'm not allowed to be in the pool with people my age who could potentially be my friends. So I kind of viewed that as a very big depiction of the racism and discrimination. So then later in the book, actually I think the last page before the author's note in the book, on page 35, there was this picture. And it was when the schools were finally integrated, and that's Sylvia on the swing, and she's made a new friend, and her friend happens to be white. And so the schools were integrated at this point, and so Sylvia got to go to the white school, and she started to make new friends. And I think that especially combated the views of discrimination. And I think using kids is a very important bit, because like I said, I don't think that kids always understand the reason for adult logic, if we can even call it logic if it's not really logical. Because kids are just kind of like, well, yeah, they've got a different skin color than me, but they also, you know, they like to play on the swings at recess, or they also like to play hopscotch, or something else that they have in common, and they find the similarities rather than focusing on those differences. So I think showing that eventually not only did Sylvia actually win the case and get to go to a school that would give her a good opportunity to get a good education, but, you know, she also made friends who did not look exactly like her, but it wasn't a big issue. They kind of got past whatever it was that the rest of the country was hung up on. And so in the story, I think Sylvia kind of became an inadvertent activist. I don't think that she really planned on being an activist, because at this point she was going into the 3rd grade, so 10, 11 years old. But while the court case was going on, and while her dad was, fighting and creating the lawsuit to get his kids in a good school, she was in that courtroom every day, and she got to see the court proceedings every day, and she was fighting for her right to go to school, and a good school, every single day. And there was a part that said that, other kids had been being called up, other students had been being called up to testify, and she said, I'm ready to tell my story if they call me up. And certain arguments that the defense lawyers were using as excuses, she had to kind of bite her tongue at, when they said they were lacking personal hygiene, when they said they lacked good manners and good economic levels and all of that. She kind of had to bite her tongue, and I think that showed that took a lot of strength for a 10-year-old to not only recognize that wasn't right what was happening, but to realize that what was being said about her people, she kind of had to keep her emotions in check and show we're civilized people, we deserve to be here, all of that. So I think that's how Sylvia kind of ended up becoming this big activist. And so yeah, and like I said, that story did not get a lot of notice when it was going on, and in the end of the book in the author's note it said only recently, in recent decades, or since the early 2000s, has that case gotten any attention. And like I said, it might have been because it didn't go to the Supreme Court like Board of Education did. It might have been a, black versus white instead of Mexican American versus white thing. But I did not know the story of Sylvia Mendez and her family, and I'm really glad that I got the opportunity to read about it, because I found it very interesting to see that there were such similar court cases happening just 7 years prior to the biggest court case, not only in history, but, for me as an educator, because that, completely changed the face of who I might have had in my classroom one day. So that's all for Separate is Never Equal, and I'm going to do another video in just a minute about One Last Word.